On a frozen Christmas night, when the streets were silent and the snow swallowed every sound, no one was supposed to be watching that dark alley. No one, except a homeless old man and his German shepherd. Beneath the falling snow lay a police officer, beaten, bound, and left to die. His badge was buried in ice, his breath was fading, and the world had already moved on. But then, a low growl cut through the storm. A dog stepped forward, placing his body between death and a man he had never met. An old man followed, shaking hands, broken pride, but a heart that refused to look away. That night, 3 forgotten souls collided, and what began as violence would become a miracle. Because sometimes salvation doesn't come with sirens or angels. It comes with 4 paws, a trembling voice, and the courage to stay. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and leave a like. Your support truly means the world to us. Ashford Hollow, Vermont. December 24th, late evening. Snow had been falling since mid-afternoon, thick and relentless, the kind that softened sound and erased edges. By nightfall, the town was buried beneath a white hush, streetlights glowing like distant stars caught in glass. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, the cold sharp enough to bite through fabric and bone alike. Christmas Eve usually brought warmth to Ashford Hollow, lit windows, church bells, families gathering. But this year, the storm swallowed everything. At the far end of Main Street stood an old storefront that had been closed for nearly a decade. Its sign was faded, its windows boarded from the inside. Beneath its shallow overhang, a man and a dog had made their shelter. Walter Haynes was 68 years old, though the years weighed heavier on him than the number suggested. He had been homeless for nearly 7 winters now. Once he had been a carpenter. Steady hands, honest work, a small house outside town. That life was gone, folded away by loss and time. What remained was a quiet man with a weathered face, a cautious gaze, and a habit of listening more than speaking. Beside him lay Bear, a male German shepherd, roughly 6 years old. Bear's coat was black and brown, dulled by dirt and snow, but his posture carried strength. He was not young, yet not old either, an animal shaped by hardship rather than age. Walter had found him 3 years earlier behind an abandoned diner, injured and half-starved. Neither had asked questions. They had simply stayed. They did not belong to each other in the way people like to label things. Walter never called himself Bear's owner. Bear never behaved like a pet. They shared food. They shared warmth. And when danger came, they watched each other's backs. That night, the cold was worse than usual. Walter tucked his thin gloves tighter around his hands and rose slowly from the milk crate he used as a seat. The paper bag at his feet was nearly empty. Whatever scraps he'd collected earlier had been gone by sundown. "Come on," he murmured, more to himself than to Bear. Bear stood immediately, shaking snow from his back, ears alert. Walter clipped the worn leash to Bear's collar, not because the dog needed it, but because it kept people calm. Together, they stepped away from the shelter and headed toward the back alleys that ran behind the main strip of stores. The town was quiet. Too quiet. Snow muffled their footsteps, and the wind threaded through narrow passages between buildings, carrying the smells of ice, metal, and old garbage. They were halfway down the alley behind a closed hardware store when Bear stopped. It was sudden. The leash snapped tight in Walter's hand as Bear leaned forward, body low, muscles rigid. A low growl vibrated from deep in his chest, soft but unmistakable. "Easy," Walter whispered instinctively. Bear did not move. His ears were pinned forward, eyes fixed. Ahead, nostrils flaring as he inhaled the frozen air. Then he pulled, hard, toward the darker end of the alley. Walter stumbled a step before catching himself. His heart began to thud, slow and heavy. "Bear," he warned quietly. But Bear was no longer listening. They rounded the corner near the dumpsters, and the alley opened into a narrow corridor between two brick buildings. The streetlight overhead flickered, casting uneven shadows across the snow. That was when Walter saw him. A man lay slumped against the wall, half buried beneath fresh snowfall. His hands were bound behind his back with what looked like zip ties cutting into his wrists. His head lolled unnaturally to one side, dark blood frozen along his temple and cheek. The navy fabric of a police uniform was torn, soaked through at the shoulder and ribs. A badge glinted faintly beneath a layer of ice. Officer Benjamin Hale was 38 years old, a patrol officer with the Ashford Hollow Police Department, known among his colleagues as quiet, methodical, and stubbornly honest. He had grown up 2 towns over, joined the force after serving as a military police officer, and had recently taken on work that made certain people uncomfortable. None of that mattered now. What mattered was that he wasn't moving. Walter's breath caught painfully in his chest. "Oh no," he whispered. Bear surged forward, planting himself between the fallen officer and the open alley, standing broadside as if bracing against something unseen. His growl deepened, warning, protective. Then, slowly, he lowered himself beside the man and pressed his body against Benjamin's chest and side, shielding him from the wind. Walter stared. Bear had never done this before. Kneeling beside them, Walter reached out with trembling hands. He did not touch the officer at first. He listened, leaned close, counted, a breath, shallow, uneven, but there. "Stay," Walter murmured to Bear, though the dog hadn't moved an inch. The snow continued to fall, settling over all 3 of them. Walter looked down at the man's face, bruised, swollen, eyes closed tight as if even unconsciousness was a battle. This wasn't a mugging. Walter had lived on the streets long enough to know the difference. This was a message. His first instinct screamed at him to leave, to back away, to disappear into the storm the way the rest of the world already had. But Bear shifted closer, curling protectively around the officer's torso, his breath fogging the air. One large paw rested against the man's chest as if counting each rise and fall. Walter swallowed hard. 2 survivors, 1 dying man, and a choice that would change everything. He looked down the alley, then back at the officer's frozen face. "All right," he whispered hoarsely. "All right. I won't leave you." He rose unsteadily to his feet, heart pounding, already searching the darkness for the nearest emergency call box. Behind him, Bear did not look away from the man he guarded. Snow fell heavier, and in that nameless alley, on a night meant for miracles, 3 lives quietly collided. Walter Haynes did not move at first. He stood a few steps away from the alley wall, the leash clenched in his stiff fingers, his breath coming out in short, fogged bursts. His eyes flicked instinctively toward the mouth of the alley, then back down to the motionless body on the snow. He had seen injured people before. He had seen drunks collapse, addicts nod off, men beaten and left bleeding. But this was different. This man wore a badge. This man would bring questions. And questions, Walter knew, were dangerous for someone like him. If he stayed, he could be blamed. If he touched the officer, he could be accused. If someone came around the corner at the wrong moment, the story could turn on him in seconds. A homeless old man standing over a beaten cop in a dark alley on Christmas Eve was not the kind of picture that ended well. His instincts screamed one word into his chest. Leave. He took one slow step backward. Bear reacted instantly. The German Shepherd shifted his weight and pressed closer to Officer Benjamin Hale's body, angling himself so the wind hit his back instead of the man's face. The dog's spine curved protectively, ribs expanding and contracting in a steady rhythm. A soft sound escaped his throat, not a growl this time, but something lower, almost strained. Bear's muzzle nudged against Benjamin's collarbone, then settled again, his chest rising and falling directly against the officer's. Walter froze. He had never seen Bear do this. Not for him, not for anyone. Bear, Walter whispered, his voice barely steady enough to form the word. The dog did not look up. Walter swallowed hard and forced himself closer. He crouched, joints aching, and reached out with bare fingers that stung instantly from the cold. He touched the officer's shoulder. The fabric was stiff with ice. The body beneath it was frighteningly still. "Sir," Walter murmured. "Sir, can you hear me?" There was no response. Walter's hand drifted to the man's wrist, awkwardly trying to find a pulse through numb skin and the edge of the zip ties. He counted again, slower this time. One shallow beat, then another. Too slow, too weak. Panic crept in, sharp and disorienting. He glanced again toward the street, half expecting headlights, half dreading them. He imagined voices shouting, hands grabbing him, the familiar accusation forming before anyone asked a single question. What were you doing here? His mind betrayed him then, dragging him backward through time. 6 winters ago, he had collapsed on a sidewalk 2 blocks from here. The cold had taken his legs out from under him, dropped him hard onto the concrete. He remembered lying there, staring at the glow of a holiday wreath in a nearby window. People had stepped around him. A woman had looked down once, hesitated, then kept walking. He had lain there until morning, half-conscious, fingers blackened with frostbite. No one had wanted to see him. Walter's chest tightened, now with the echo of that memory. He looked down at Benjamin Hale's face, swollen, bloodied, unrecognizable beneath the snow, and understood with painful clarity that the officer was exactly where Walter had been back then. Invisible, conveniently ignored. Bear shifted again, adjusting his position, tucking his head closer to the officer's neck. His breath steamed, creating a pocket of warmth that fought desperately against the cold. "All right," Walter said quietly, voice shaking. "All right. I see you." He tried to lift Benjamin then, bracing his boots in the snow, hooking his arms awkwardly beneath the man's shoulders. Pain flared through his lower back instantly. Benjamin's body barely moved, heavy and uncooperative, dead weight resisting every pull. Walter strained, teeth clenched, muscles trembling, but the officer slid only an inch before Walter lost his footing and fell back onto the snow. He sat there for a moment, gasping, staring at his own hands as they shook uncontrollably. "I can't," he muttered. "I can't move you." Bear lifted his head and looked at Walter for the first time. His amber eyes were alert, focused, unsettlingly aware. Then he looked back down at the officer and resumed his position without hesitation. The dog had made his choice. Walter let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, brittle and humorless. "Figures," he said softly. "You always were braver than me." The decision settled into him then, not cleanly, not heroically, but heavily, like a coat he could not take off. He pushed himself to his feet, legs unsteady, and scanned the alley. The nearest emergency fire alarm was 3 buildings down, bolted to a brick wall near the corner. He hesitated one last time, eyes locked on Bear and the unconscious officer. "Don't move," he told the dog, knowing how absurd the words sounded. Bear did not even flick an ear. Walter turned and ran. His boots slipped on packed snow as he stumbled down the alley, breath burning his lungs. Every step felt like a risk. Every shadow felt like a witness. When he reached the corner, his hand slammed against the red metal casing of the fire alarm. For a heartbeat, he froze, palm pressed flat, pulse roaring in his ears. Then he pulled. The alarm shattered the silence violently. A harsh, mechanical shriek tore through the night, echoing off brick and glass, cutting through the snowstorm like a blade. Walter flinched at the sound, heart pounding so hard he thought it might crack his ribs. He did not wait. The moment the alarm sounded, he turned and hurried back the way he came, fear chasing him faster than the cold ever had. The noise followed him, relentless, impossible to ignore. Lights flicked on in distant windows. Somewhere, a door opened. Somewhere else, someone shouted a curse. When Walter reached the alley again, Bear was exactly where he had left him. The dog's body was still curved around Officer Benjamin. Hale, his stance unbroken, his focus absolute. Snow had already begun to coat Bear's back, but he did not shake it off. He did not move. He simply stayed. Walter dropped to his knees beside them, breath ragged, chest tight with something dangerously close to relief. "Help's coming," he whispered, though he didn't know who he was reassuring, himself, the dog, or the man barely clinging to life between them. He peeled off his own thin scarf and carefully draped it over Benjamin's exposed neck, tucking it clumsily beneath the officer's collar. It was a small thing. A useless thing, maybe, but it was all he had. Bear shifted just enough to allow it, then settled again. Walter looked down at the two of them, one a trained protector broken and bound, the other a stray who had chosen to guard him anyway, and felt something unfamiliar twist in his chest. Not hope. He had learned better than that, but something close, something stubborn. The alarm continued to wail in the distance, drawing the world back toward the alley whether it wanted to come or not. Walter stayed. So did Bear. And for the first time in a very long time, Walter Haynes did not feel invisible. The alarm did not fade gently. It screamed until it tore the quiet night open, until headlights cut through the darkness and engines growled closer. Walter felt the vibration of it in his chest long before he saw the first cruiser turn into the alley. He stayed where he was, kneeling in the snow beside Bear and the unconscious officer, his hands raised slightly, palms open, the way instinct told him to do when authority arrived. The first patrol car skidded to a stop at the alley's mouth. Doors flew open. Boots hit the ground. Two officers approached quickly, hands already resting near their belts. The taller of the two was Officer Mark Ellison, early 40s, a patrol veteran with a cautious temperament shaped by years of late-night calls that went wrong. His partner, Officer Jenna Morales, late 20s, newer to the force, followed half a step behind, eyes sharp, taking in every detail. "Don't move," Ellison ordered, his voice firm and practiced. His gaze flicked from Walter's layered, worn clothing to the dog pressed against the fallen officer. "Hands where I can see them." Walter lifted his hands higher. "I didn't do this," he said quickly, his voice cracking despite himself. "I found him. I pulled the alarm." Morales glanced past Walter, her eyes landing on the badge half buried in snow. Her posture shifted instantly. "That's one of ours," she said. Bear reacted the moment Ellison took a step forward. The German shepherd rose to his feet in a single fluid motion, positioning himself squarely between the officers and Officer Benjamin Hale. His lips pulled back, teeth flashing, a deep, thunderous growl rolling from his chest. It wasn't wild. It wasn't frantic. It was controlled, deliberate, a warning delivered with absolute clarity. Ellison stopped short. Morales lifted a hand instinctively. "Easy." Morales said, lowering her voice. "Easy, boy." Bear did not budge. Walter felt panic surge again. "He won't bite," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure. He's protecting him." Ellison's jaw tightened. That dog needs to be restrained. Before anyone could move again, the wail of a second vehicle joined the alarm's echo. An ambulance backed into the alley, its lights washing the brick walls in red and blue. 2 EMTs jumped out, pulling equipment from the rear. The first was Rachel Turner, mid-30s, a senior paramedic known among her team for her calm under pressure. She took one look at the scene: the unconscious officer, the growling dog, the shaking old man, and lifted a hand. "Hold up," she said. "Nobody rushes in." Her partner, Evan Brooks, a stocky man in his early 30s with a quiet demeanor, followed her lead, stopping a few feet back. Rachel crouched slightly, meeting Bear's eyes without challenging him. "Hey," she said gently, "you're doing a good job. I need to check him, okay?" Bear's growl deepened, but his eyes flicked back toward Benjamin's face, then returned to Rachel. Walter swallowed. "He hasn't left him," he said. "Not once." Rachel nodded once as if that confirmed something for her. She turned her head slightly toward Ellison. "If you rush this, that officer's done. He's hypothermic and barely breathing. Let me work." Ellison hesitated, clearly torn between protocol and the urgency of the moment. Morales leaned closer to him and murmured, "She's right." Rachel shifted her attention back to Walter. "Sir," she said, "can you tell me what happened?" Walter answered haltingly, words stumbling over each other as he explained how they'd found Benjamin, how Bear had stopped and refused to move, how he'd pulled the fire alarm. He expected interruption. He expected disbelief. Instead, Rachel listened. When he finished, she nodded again and motioned to Evan. "Blanket. Oxygen." Evan edged forward slowly, deliberately. Bear's growl followed him like a warning siren. Rachel lifted her hand again, steady. "Easy," she repeated. "We're here to help." She inched closer herself, moving sideways rather than straight on, keeping her body low. When she reached Benjamin's side, she knelt and placed 2 fingers carefully at his neck. Her face tightened. "Pulse is thready," she said. "Core temp's dropping fast." She looked up at Ellison. "Another 15 minutes out here and he wouldn't have made it." The words landed heavily. Morales exhaled slowly. Ellison's expression shifted from suspicion to something closer to grim understanding. Rachel gently slid an oxygen mask toward Benjamin's face. Bear stiffened, but did not snap. Instead, he leaned back just enough to allow the mask to be placed, then settled again, his shoulder pressed firmly against the officer's ribs. "That's a trained response," Evan muttered under his breath as he wrapped a thermal blanket around Benjamin's legs. "This dog's not a stray." Morales frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Evan nodded toward Bear. "He's pacing his breathing. He adjusted position when we moved the mask. That's not instinct, that's conditioning." Ellison studied Bear more closely now. "You're saying he's canine?" "Was," Evan said, "or something close to it." Rachel glanced back at Walter. "How long have you had him?" Walter shook his head. "I don't own him," he said quietly. "He just stayed." Ellison straightened. "Sir, I'm going to need your name." Walter hesitated, the old fear rising again. Walter Haynes." Ellison nodded once, making a note. "You're not under arrest. For now." Morales shot him a look. Ellison ignored it, his attention shifting fully to Benjamin as Evan and Rachel carefully cut the zip ties from his wrists. As they lifted Benjamin onto the stretcher, Bear resisted at first, stepping closer, blocking the movement. Rachel paused immediately. "It's okay," she said softly. "He's going with us." Walter found himself speaking before he thought. "He won't let go," he said. "Not unless he knows." Rachel looked at Bear again, then at Walter. "Can you talk to him?" Walter swallowed and leaned closer to the dog. "Bear," he whispered. "They're helping him. You did good. You can let them take him now." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Bear stepped back. Just one step. Enough. The stretcher rolled forward. As Benjamin was loaded into the ambulance, Bear followed, stopping only when the doors closed. He sat in the snow, ears forward, eyes fixed on the red lights through the rear windows. Walter felt something tighten painfully behind his ribs. Ellison turned back toward him. "You'll need to come with us," he said, "just to give a statement." Walter nodded slowly. For once, the words didn't sound like a threat. As the ambulance pulled away, its lights disappearing into the night, Bear rose and moved back to Walter's side without hesitation. The alarm finally fell silent, and under the fading wash of red and blue, Walter Haynes stood where he had once been invisible, seen at last, whether he was ready for it or not. The ride to the hospital blurred together for Walter Haynes. He sat rigid in the back of a cruiser, hands folded on his knees, Bear pressed close against his leg as if anchoring him to the present. When they arrived, everything moved fast. Doors opening, voices overlapping, the stretcher rolling away with Officer Benjamin Hale strapped down and disappearing through a set of swinging doors marked emergency. Walter tried to follow, but a uniformed hand lifted gently in front of his chest. "That's as far as you go," the officer said, not unkindly. Walter nodded. He was used to stopping where he was told. Bear was not. The German shepherd halted at the threshold and planted himself squarely in front of the doors. He sat, spine straight, eyes fixed on the place where Benjamin had vanished. When a nurse tried to guide him away, Bear leaned his weight back and refused to move. There was no growling this time, no bared teeth, just an unyielding presence that said, "This is where I stay." A security guard approached, then paused. Thomas Klein, early 50s, a former corrections officer who now worked nights at the hospital, took one look at Bear and sighed. He had seen a lot of frightened families and aggressive dogs in his time, but this was neither. "He's not causing trouble," Klein said to the nurse. "Let him sit. I'll keep an eye on him." Walter exhaled slowly. He hadn't realized how tightly he'd been holding his breath. They ushered Walter into the waiting area just beyond the emergency corridor. The chairs were stiff plastic, bolted to the floor, and the lights hummed overhead. A vending machine whirred in the corner. The clock on the wall read 10:17 p.m. Christmas Eve. Walter lowered himself into a chair near the doors, joints protesting. Bear sat a few feet away, directly in front of the corridor entrance, head high, eyes alert. People passed, doctors, nurses, orderlies, but Bear did not acknowledge them. He watched only the doors. A woman in scrubs paused nearby, holding 2 paper cups. She was Linda Perez, early 40s, a night shift nurse who had transferred to Ashford Hollow after her husband's deployment ended. She looked tired in the way only caregivers did, but her eyes were gentle. She offered one of the cups to Walter. "Coffee," she said. "It's not great, but it's hot." Walter stared at it as if it might disappear. "Thank you," he said finally, accepting it with both hands. The warmth seeped into his fingers, then deeper. He took a careful sip and closed his eyes for a second. It had been years since someone had handed him something without asking for anything in return. Linda glanced at Bear. "He's waiting for someone," she said quietly. Walter nodded. He always does. The night stretched on. Time inside the hospital moved differently, measured in beeps, footsteps, and the occasional murmur of a name called softly from behind the doors. Walter watched the second, hand on the clock complete its endless circles. He tried not to imagine what was happening beyond the wall. He tried not to picture blood, cold steel instruments, the possibility of silence. At some point, fatigue claimed him. His head tipped forward, chin resting against his chest, coffee cooling in his hands. He slept sitting up, the way he had learned to on benches and bus stops, drifting in and out of shallow dreams. In one of those half-dreams, he saw Bear as he'd first found him, limping, ribs visible, eyes wary. In another, he saw himself years earlier, standing in his old workshop with sawdust on his boots and a future that hadn't yet slipped through his fingers. A voice pulled him back. "Walter?" He blinked and lifted his head. A man stood a few feet away, holding a clipboard. He wore a rumpled suit beneath a winter coat and looked younger than Walter expected, early 30s maybe, with the strained composure of someone who spent his nights delivering bad news. This was Dr. Samuel Wright, the attending emergency physician on duty, newly assigned to the hospital after finishing his residency in a larger city. He had the cautious tone of someone choosing words carefully. "I'm Dr. Wright," he said. "I wanted to let you know. The officer is stable. He's still unconscious, but he's breathing on his own now." Walter swallowed. "He's alive?" "Yes," Wright said. "You got him here in time." Walter's shoulders sagged, relief washing through him so suddenly it made him dizzy. "Thank God," he whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was thanking. Bear's ears twitched at the sound of voices. He rose from his seated position and took one step closer to the doors, tail still, body tense but hopeful. Dr. Wright noticed him then. "That's quite a dog," he said. "He hasn't moved all night." "He won't," Walter said simply. The doctor hesitated, then added, "There's something else. We found multiple contusions consistent with restraint and repeated blows. This wasn't random." Walter nodded slowly. "I figured." Dr. Wright lowered his voice. "The officers have been asking questions, quietly. The impression I get is that Benjamin Hale was working a sensitive case." As if summoned by the words, another figure approached from the hallway. Detective Aaron Pike, late 40s, plain clothes, shoulders perpetually tense from years in internal investigations, stopped near Walter's chair. Pike had the look of a man who trusted facts more than people. "You're Walter Haynes," Pike said. "Yes." "I won't keep you long," Pike said. "Officer Hale has been digging into missing evidence from our property room. Firearms, ammunition, stuff that doesn't just walk off on its own." Walter frowned. "And that's why someone did this to him?" Pike did not answer directly. "It's one possible explanation." Bear shifted, eyes flicking briefly to Pike, then back to the doors. Pike noticed. "Your dog," he said. "He reacts when radios go off." Walter's brow furrowed. "He doesn't like loud noises." "That's not what I mean," Pike replied. "He reacts to the signal, timing, frequency." Walter hesitated. "I don't know anything about that," he said truthfully. Pike studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "All right, get some rest." He turned and walked away. The waiting area grew quieter as midnight approached. Decorations hung from the ceiling, paper snowflakes, a crooked wreath, but they felt distant, like props from a play Walter no longer belonged to. Bear remained at his post. At exactly 12:06 a.m., the doors opened again. A nurse stepped out, scanning the room. "Walter Haynes?" she called softly. Walter stood too quickly, knees protesting. "Yes." She smiled gently. "He hasn't woken up yet," she said, "but—" He asked if his dog was here. Walter's heart skipped. "He did?" "Yes," she said, "and he seemed calmer when I told him someone was waiting." Walter looked down at Bear, the dog's ears lifted higher, his entire body angling toward the sound of the nurse's voice. "He's been waiting," Walter said. The nurse nodded. "I can't let you in yet," she added, "but you can stay." Walter sank back into his chair, exhausted but lighter than he'd been in years. He took the last sip of his now lukewarm coffee and let his eyes close again. Bear sat. He watched. He waited. And through the long hours of Christmas night, when the world beyond the hospital forgot the names of the lost and the found alike, one dog kept vigil at a door, guarding a man who had nearly died unseen. Walter Haynes was awake when it happened, not fully alert, not fully asleep, caught in that fragile space where exhaustion loosens its grip just enough for the mind to wander. His chin had slipped from his chest, his hands resting loosely in his lap, the empty coffee cup tipped on its side at his feet. Bear still sat at his post near the doors, unmoving, as if carved from patience itself. The doors opened quietly. A nurse stepped out and looked around the waiting area before spotting Walter. She was Emily Ross, late 20s, a junior nurse still new enough to the night shift that she carried a careful attentiveness in everything she did. "Mr. Haynes," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. "He's awake." Walter straightened immediately. "He is?" She nodded. "He's still weak, but he's conscious. He asked for the dog." Before Walter could respond, Bear was already on his feet. His ears snapped forward, his body leaning toward the doorway, every muscle suddenly alive. The leash slid across the floor as he took 2 eager steps, then stopped himself, waiting, barely. Emily hesitated. "Just a moment," she said. "I need to warn you. He's confused. He's been in and out." Walter nodded. "That's fine," he said. His voice came out hoarse. "He's been waiting." Emily glanced at Bear again, something like a smile touching her face. "I can see that." She opened the door and gestured them inside. Officer Benjamin Hale lay propped up against pillows, an oxygen cannula resting beneath his nose, one arm immobilized, the other pale and still atop the blanket. His face bore the marks of the beating, bruises blooming deep and dark, but his eyes were open now, focused, searching. The moment Bear crossed the threshold, Benjamin's gaze locked onto him. Time seemed to slow. Benjamin's brow furrowed, his breath hitching slightly as his eyes traced the familiar shape of the dog's head, the angle of his ears, the scar just visible along the muzzle. His lips parted. "Atlas?" he whispered. The name was barely sound, more breath than word. Bear froze, not stiffening in warning, not recoiling, but freezing as if the name itself had weight. His ears twitched once. His eyes widened, pupils sharpening. Then a low, startled sound escaped his throat, something between a whine and a breath he'd been holding for years. He stepped forward. Walter's heart slammed against his ribs. "Bear?" he murmured, uncertain. Bear ignored him. The German shepherd closed the distance to the bed and lifted his head slowly, carefully, as if afraid the moment would shatter. His nose hovered inches from Benjamin's hand, then touched it. Benjamin's fingers twitched. "Hey," Benjamin whispered, tears gathering unbidden at the corners of his eyes. "It's you." Bear's tail began to move, not fast, not wild, but deliberate, sweeping the air behind him. He let out a soft, broken sound, pressed his forehead gently against Benjamin's wrist, inhaling deeply. Then, unmistakably, he whined. Emily sucked in a quiet breath. "He knows him," she whispered. Walter stood frozen near the door, his mind racing. "Atlas?" he repeated under his breath. Benjamin's breathing grew uneven. "I thought you were gone," he said, voice cracking. "They told me you never came back." Bear let out a single, sharp bark, not aggressive, not loud, but urgent. He shifted closer, placing his front paws carefully on the edge of the bed, resting his weight there as if reclaiming ground he'd lost. Emily stepped back instinctively, then stopped when Benjamin lifted his good hand. "It's okay," he said. He's allowed." Walter took a hesitant step forward. "Officer," he said gently. "I didn't know his name. I found him years ago. He stayed with me." Benjamin's eyes flicked toward Walter then, really seeing him for the first time. A homeless old man with shaking hands. A leash worn thin by years of use. A life that didn't fit neatly into reports or files. "You kept him alive," Benjamin said. "Didn't you?" Walter swallowed. "We kept each other alive." Benjamin nodded slowly, as if that made perfect sense. He closed his eyes for a moment, gathering strength, then opened them again. "Atlas was my partner," he said. "Canine unit. 5 years back." Emily stiffened slightly. "Canine?" "Yes," Benjamin said. "Search and apprehension, evidence tracking. He was good. Too good." Bear responded to the change in tone, lifting his head, ears alert. "We were working a case," Benjamin continued, his voice low. "Internal. Weapons going missing from evidence. At first, it looked like paperwork errors. Then I noticed patterns, the same officers' names, the same storage access points." Walter listened, every word sinking in. "One night," Benjamin said, "Atlas and I were called out to a warehouse on a tip. It was supposed to be routine. It wasn't." His jaw tightened. "There was a fire, small, controlled. Enough chaos to cover movement. Atlas went in after a scent. I followed. Shots were fired." Bear's body tensed, muscles bunching as if the memory lived inside him too. "I woke up in the hospital," Benjamin said. "They told me Atlas had run, that he'd bolted in the smoke and never been found. Case got buried not long after." Emily's face paled. "And now?" Benjamin's eyes hardened. "Now I know he didn't run." Bear let out a low growl, not aimed at anyone in the room, but at something distant and remembered. "They left him," Benjamin said quietly, "same way they tried to leave me." The room fell silent. Walter felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "So, the alley," he said slowly. "That wasn't a robbery." Benjamin shook his head. "No," he said. "It was a warning." Bear shifted his weight, leaning closer to Benjamin's chest, as if confirming the truth of it. Emily cleared her throat softly. "I should let the doctor know you're awake," she said. "But—" "We can give you a few minutes." She stepped out, closing the door gently behind her. Walter approached the bed then, closer than he'd dared before. "He's been different," he admitted. "Alert, protective. I thought it was just survival." Benjamin looked at Bear, something like grief and pride mingling in his expression. "He had a job," he said. "A purpose." Walter nodded slowly. "Guess he never forgot." Bear let out a quiet huff, almost indignant. Benjamin's gaze returned to Walter. "They wanted me silent," he said. "If I died out there, it would have looked like just another crime. No questions. No loose ends." Walter thought of the zip ties, the alley, the way Bear had stood between him and the world. "But you didn't," he said. "No," Benjamin replied. "Because of you." Bear shifted his paws slightly, adjusting his position as if settling in for a long stay. Benjamin's eyes fluttered, fatigue catching up to him. "Atlas," he whispered again, softer now. Bear leaned in immediately, pressing his nose against Benjamin's cheek. Walter watched the exchange, his chest aching with a mix of wonder and sorrow. The dog he thought he'd rescued had, all along, been waiting. Waiting for a name. waiting for a reason to stay alive beyond the next meal. Benjamin's eyes closed, but his hand remained tangled lightly in Bear's fur. Walter stepped back, giving them space. Outside the room, the hospital hummed on, unaware that a missing piece had just fallen back into place. The name had returned, and, with it, the truth neither man nor dog could outrun any longer. The first sign came quietly. Walter Haynes felt it before he understood it, an unease crawling along his spine as he and Bear stepped out of the hospital doors together. Benjamin Hale had been moved to a guarded recovery wing, and Walter had been told he was free to go for the night. Free was a strange word. It meant walking back into the dark with no badge, no protection, and the knowledge that someone had tried to erase a man who now knew too much. Bear paused at the curb. His ears tilted back, then forward again, catching something Walter could not. His body stiffened, leash pulling tight as he angled his head toward the parking structure across the street. He did not growl. He did not bark. He simply stopped moving, muscles coiled beneath his fur. "What is it?" Walter whispered. Bear inhaled deeply, nostrils flaring. Then he stepped forward again, deliberately slow, glancing back once to make sure Walter followed. They walked 2 blocks before Walter noticed it himself, the sense of being watched. A car idled too long at a stop sign. Headlights dimmed, then brightened again. When Walter slowed, the car slowed too. His heart began to hammer. He turned sharply into a side street. The car followed. "Bear," Walter murmured, fear tightening his throat. Bear did not panic. He moved with purpose now, guiding Walter not away from the threat, but through it, cutting behind a closed storefront, then into a narrow service lane. At the end of the lane, Bear stopped again and sniffed the ground intensely. Nose pressed to the pavement. Then he sat. Not tired, not confused. Sitting meant something else. Walter remembered Benjamin's words. Conditioning. Training. Bear rose and veered left, pulling the leash hard. Walter stumbled after him, breath ragged. The street opened into an industrial stretch at the edge of town, where warehouses squatted unused, their loading docks dark and silent. Bear's pace quickened. Behind them, the car slowed. Walter's fear crystallized into certainty. "They know," he whispered. "They know he lived." Bear let out a low sound, not fear, but warning, and tugged Walter toward a chain-link fence that bordered one of the larger warehouses. The gate hung slightly ajar. Bear slipped through without hesitation, dragging Walter along. Inside the yard, Bear dropped his nose again, tracing a path with precision. He moved from the fence line to the rear entrance of the warehouse, stopping at a rusted door. He sniffed the handle, then the ground beneath it, then the nearby wall. He scratched once, then he looked back at Walter. Walter's hands shook as he reached for his phone. His fingers fumbled, but he managed to dial the number Benjamin had quietly given him earlier that evening. "If anything feels wrong," Benjamin had said, "call this." The line connected on the third ring. "Hale," Benjamin said, voice weak but alert. "They followed us," Walter said breathlessly. Bear found something. A warehouse." There was a pause. Then, "Stay where you are," Benjamin said. "I'm calling it in." Minutes stretched thin. Bear moved again, circling the area, nose low. He stopped near a drainage ditch and began pawing at the dirt, then urinated deliberately along the edge of the fence. Walter watched, confused, until Bear repeated the behavior at the corner of the building, then again near a stack of abandoned pallets. Marking. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the air. Bear lifted his head, ears snapping toward the noise, then sat beside Walter, posture calm and steady. 2 cruisers arrived first, followed by an unmarked SUV. Officers spilled out, weapons drawn, movements sharp and controlled. One of them approached Walter cautiously. "Sir," he said, "I'm Detective Aaron Pike." They had met briefly at the hospital. Pike looked more alert now, tension etched deeper into his face. Walter lifted his hands instinctively. "I called," he said. "We didn't go looking for trouble. The dog found this place." Pike's gaze shifted to Bear, then to the warehouse door. "What exactly did he find?" Bear answered by standing and pulling gently toward the door again. Pike exhaled slowly. "All right," he said. "Let's do this clean." Additional units arrived, setting a perimeter. Officers moved toward the warehouse entrance while others circled the building. Bear strained against the leash, whining softly. Not panicked, but urgent. Inside, the warehouse was empty of people, but not of evidence. Crates lay stacked near the back wall, their markings scratched off. Several had been pried open, revealing weapons wrapped in oil-stained cloth. Radios crackled as officers called it in. "This is it," Pike muttered. "This is the missing inventory." One officer knelt near a side exit and swore under his breath. "Fresh tire tracks," he said. "Someone left in a hurry." Bear lunged toward the tracks, nose pressed to the ground, following the scent trail without hesitation. He pulled Walter along before Pike could stop them. "Let him work," Pike said quietly. "He knows what he's doing." The trail led behind the warehouse toward a narrow access road. Halfway there, Bear stopped and scratched at the dirt again, then marked the ground, then moved on. "He's mapping their route," one officer murmured. "He's marking the escape path." Walter stared at Bear in awe and fear. "He never did that before," he whispered. "Because he didn't need to," Pike replied. "Until now." The chase itself did not happen that night. Whoever had been there had fled early enough to avoid capture, but they had left too much behind. Too many fingerprints, too many mistakes. Walter sat on the curb as officers finished documenting the scene, his body finally trembling as the adrenaline drained away. Bear sat, pressed against his side. Watchful, but calm, Pike approached again, his expression unreadable. "You understand what this means?" he said. Walter nodded slowly. "They'll come back." "Yes," Pike said, "and that's why I need you to do something difficult." Walter looked up. "What?" "I need you to be a witness," Pike said. "Officially. You found the officer. You led us here. Your dog connected the dots." Walter's stomach clenched. "I'm not protected," he said. "I don't have anywhere to go." Pike held his gaze. "You won't be alone," he said. "Not anymore." Walter glanced down at Bear, who met his eyes steadily, tail thumping once against the pavement. He thought of the night years ago when no one had stopped for him, of the cold concrete, of the feeling of being disposable. Then he thought of Benjamin Hale, lying in a hospital bed because someone had chosen not to look away. "All right," Walter said quietly. "I'll do it." Pike nodded. "Good." As the officers began to clear the scene, Bear lifted his head once more and scanned the darkness beyond the fence. His ears twitched, catching something far away, then relaxed. For now, the trail had gone cold. But the ones who wanted Benjamin Hale erased had made a mistake. They had underestimated the man who refused to disappear, and the dog who remembered exactly how to hunt. The unraveling did not happen with a single arrest or a dramatic confession. It came in waves. Quiet interviews, sealed warrants, doors opened at dawn by officers who no longer trusted the men standing beside them. The warehouse had been only the first knot in a web that had been tightening for years. Once the weapons were logged and traced, the names followed. Access codes, radio logs, a pattern of silence that finally broke. Walter Haynes watched it all from the edges. He gave his statement in a small interview room at the station, hands folded, voice steady despite the weight of it. Detective Aaron Pike sat across from him, recorder blinking red, asking questions that circled back again and again to the same moments. The alley, the alarm, the warehouse, the dog. Walter answered them all. He did not embellish. He did not hide. When fear rose, he acknowledged it and kept speaking anyway. By the third day, the story had a spine. 2 officers were suspended. Another resigned before the warrant could reach him. A civilian contractor tied to evidence transport vanished, then reappeared in custody in a neighboring county. The case Benjamin Hale had been buried under years ago resurfaced with teeth. Benjamin was moved from guarded recovery to a standard room, then, after much protest from the doctors, to a brief appearance at a closed-door departmental hearing. He walked with a cane and the stubborn dignity of a man who refused to look broken. The board chair was Harold McVeigh, early 60s, a career administrator whose cautious neutrality had kept him safe for decades. This time, neutrality did not survive the evidence. Benjamin spoke plainly. He named dates. He named locations. He named the night Atlas had disappeared and the night he himself had nearly followed. When questions came, he answered them without heat, without drama. When the room fell silent, it stayed that way. By the end of the week, the department issued a statement. Officer Benjamin Hale was reinstated with full honors. His suspension was voided. His record cleared. An apology, formal and insufficient, was entered into the minutes. Benjamin read the notice once, then set it aside. "It's not about the paper," he said to Walter later, voice low. "It's about the truth being said out loud." Christmas morning arrived without fanfare for Walter. He woke where he always had, on a bench near the river, with Bear pressed close, the cold softened by a donated blanket, and the strange, unfamiliar sense that something had shifted beneath his feet. The phone Pike had given him buzzed just after sunrise. "You have plans?" Pike asked. Walter hesitated. "No." "Good," Pike said. "Someone wants to see you." The church sat at the center of town, doors open, bells ringing not in triumph, but in invitation. Walter stopped short at the threshold, uncertainty pulling him back. He had passed this place countless times. He had never been asked inside. Bear nudged his leg. Walter exhaled and stepped forward. Inside, the service had already begun. Candles lined the aisle. Families filled the pews. At the front, Pastor Ellen Wright, late 50s, a woman whose calm authority came from decades of listening more than preaching, paused mid-sentence and smiled as Walter entered. "Friends," she said gently, "we have guests." Heads turned. Whispers followed. Walter's instinct was to shrink, to disappear into the wall, but then he saw Benjamin, standing carefully near the front, one hand resting on a pew. Their eyes met. Benjamin nodded once, small, certain. Pastor Wright gestured toward an open seat near the center. "Please," she said, "join us." Walter sat. No one asked him to move. The hymns passed like a warm tide. Words about peace and goodwill settled differently this year, heavier, earned. When the time came for acknowledgments, Pastor Wright cleared her throat. "Today," she said, "we give thanks not just for what has been restored, but for who made restoration possible." She invited Benjamin forward first. Applause rose, hesitant at first, then firm. Benjamin did not bow. He did not wave. He simply stood and waited for the sound to fade. "I didn't survive because I'm brave," he said. "I survived because someone refused to look away." He turned then, scanning the room until his gaze found Walter. "This man," he said, "and this dog." The room stilled. Walter felt heat rush to his face. Bear sat at his feet, ears forward, calm. Pastor Wright nodded to a woman standing near the aisle. Chief Laura Bennett, early 50s, newly appointed after the suspensions, stepped forward. Her posture was straight, her expression unguarded. "I won't pretend this fixes everything," she said. "But today, we honor what right looks like when it's inconvenient." She knelt, then, not ceremonially but practically, and clipped a small, polished emblem to Bear's collar. It bore a simple inscription, Canine Honorary Service. Bear tilted his head, confused, then accepted the attention with a single soft huff. "He won't be returning to active duty," Bennett said, "but his service stands." Applause filled the space, warmer now, freer. Walter stared at the emblem as if it might vanish. After the service, people lingered. Hands were shaken, names were exchanged. Someone pressed a paper bag of pastries into Walter's hands. Another offered coffee. A child crouched to pet Bear, asking permission first. For the first time in memory, Walter did not feel like he was trespassing. Benjamin joined him near the door. "I wanted you to hear it here," he said quietly, "where it counts." Walter nodded, words caught somewhere behind his teeth. "I didn't plan any of it." Benjamin smiled. "Neither did I." Outside, the cold still existed, but it had lost its edge. Walter stood with Bear at his side, watching townspeople drift back into their lives. He felt the weight of fear lift, replaced by something fragile and new, belonging. That night, as lights glowed in windows and the town settled into Christmas, Walter walked the familiar streets without hurrying. Bear trotted beside him, the small emblem catching light with each step. They were still who they had been, but the world had shifted enough to meet them halfway, and for the first time in a long while, the night did not feel cold. The paperwork took longer than Walter Haynes expected. Forms, signatures, interviews, steps that felt foreign after years of being waved away or overlooked. Benjamin Hale handled most of it quietly, efficiently, as if restoring order to one man's life were simply another duty he refused to abandon. He explained each step without rushing, never assuming Walter understood things he'd never been given the chance to learn. The program was called Transitional Housing Services, funded jointly by the county and a small coalition of churches and local businesses. The case manager assigned to Walter was Marianne O'Leary, early 40s, practical and warm in the way of someone who had seen both success and relapse and refused to judge either. She spoke plainly, asked direct questions, and treated Walter like a man making decisions, not a problem being solved. "You'll have your own room," she said, sliding a key across the desk. "Small, clean, heat works. That's non-negotiable." Walter picked up the key carefully, as if it might bite. "And him?" he asked, nodding toward Bear. Marianne smiled. "Already cleared. He's part of the plan." Benjamin stood nearby, arms folded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Told you," he said. The room was on the second floor of a renovated brick building not far from the center of town. It wasn't much. Bed, desk, chair, but it was his. Walter sat on the edge of the mattress that first night and waited for the familiar urge to leave, the sense that staying somewhere too long invited trouble. It never came. Bear circled the room once, sniffed every corner, then settled by the heater with a sigh that sounded like relief. Walter watched him for a long moment before sitting back and letting the quiet take hold. The next weeks unfolded gently. Bear's honorary canine designation opened unexpected doors. Dr. Nisha Patel, late 30s, a behavioral specialist contracted by the department, observed Bear during a series of calm, structured visits, First at the station, then at the shelter. She noted his steady demeanor, his responsiveness to stress, his ability to anchor anxious people without escalating their emotions. "He's not reactive," she said to Benjamin after one session. "He's grounding. That's rare." The department approved Bear as a therapy dog, not for patrol, not for pursuit, but for presence. He visited the station during long shifts, lay at the feet of officers who carried too much home with them, and accompanied outreach teams on nights when the cold returned and the streets filled with faces Walter recognized. Walter went too. At first he stayed quiet, standing back as Bear approached people curled beneath blankets, offering warmth without pressure. Then, gradually, Walter found himself talking, explaining how Bear listened, how he stayed, how survival did not have to mean isolation. People listened to Walter in a way they never had before, not because he spoke louder, but because Bear made space for his voice. By spring, Walter had begun volunteering at a small workshop run by the city's vocational program. The coordinator, Frank Delaney, late 50s, a retired contractor with a blunt manner and a soft spot for second chances, watched Walter work for one afternoon before nodding once. "You know your way around wood," Frank said. "You want to make this official?" The community shop opened 3 mornings a week in an unused garage behind the library. Walter repaired chairs, built shelves, taught anyone who asked how to measure twice and cut once. He didn't call it a business, he called it work. People brought broken things and left with them fixed. Sometimes they stayed to talk. Bear slept by the door. Ashford Hollow noticed. They noticed the dog with the small emblem on his collar, calm amid chaos. They noticed the old man who no longer slept on benches, who spoke gently to those who still did. They noticed that the cold seemed less final when Bear was near. By the time Christmas returned, the town had changed in small, meaningful ways. Walter stood in his room on Christmas Eve and adjusted the simple wreath someone had left on his door. He hadn't asked who. He hadn't needed to. Bear watched from the rug, tail tapping softly. A knock sounded. Benjamin stood in the hallway, coat dusted with snow, carrying a paper bag that smelled unmistakably of fresh bread. He looked healthier, stronger, though the cane leaned against the wall beside him, a reminder of what it had cost. "Thought I'd stop by," he said. "Hope that's okay." Walter smiled, an expression that still felt new on his face. "You're always welcome." They sat by the small electric fireplace, the room warm and quiet. Bear stretched out between them, chin resting on his paws, eyes half closed. Benjamin handed over the bag. "From the bakery on Elm," he said. "They insisted." Walter laughed softly. "They always do." They spoke of ordinary things, the shop, the therapy visits, the department's ongoing reforms. Nothing needed to be said about the alley or the warehouse or the nights that had nearly ended them all. Those truths lived comfortably now, no longer demanding attention. As midnight approached, church bells rang faintly in the distance. Walter leaned back and watched the light play across the walls, feeling something he had not felt in years. Safety. Later, after Benjamin left and the building settled into sleep, Walter sat at his desk and wrote a short note he would never send. He folded it and placed it in the drawer anyway, a ritual of closure he'd earned. Bear lifted his head and looked at him. "I know," Walter said quietly. "We made it." Outside, the town rested. Inside, a fire hummed. 3 lives, once drifting, once hunted, once forgotten, had found their way into alignment. No one among them was invisible anymore. They had a place to return. Sometimes we wait for miracles to come with thunder or light from the sky, but this story reminds us that God often works in quieter ways. through a homeless man who refused to walk away, through a loyal dog who remembered his purpose, through a broken moment that became a doorway to hope. In our daily lives, we pass people who feel invisible. We hear cries that are easy to ignore. But when we choose compassion instead of fear, we become part of God's work. Even small acts of courage can change the course of a life. If this story touched your heart, let it remind you to look again, to stay, to help when it is hard. Please share this story with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and type Amen. If you believe God still works through ordinary people and unexpected miracles. Subscribe to the channel to continue spreading faith, kindness, and light. May God bless you and protect you wherever you are watching from.